If you are writing a dissertation or journal article manuscript for peer review, have you been wondering whether your writing of literature review is actually good? You may have read hundreds of articles, you may have dozens of pages of notes. You may even have a draft that is full of citations. But many literature reviews still fail to convince dissertation committees, peer reviewers, and journal editors. Why? After about 2 decades in academia, I've read countless literature reviews as an associate editor of American Educational Research Journal, AEIJ. I see recurring patterns in both successful and unsuccessful manuscript. I've also published many journal articles myself. Today, I want to discuss 3 common problems in writing literature reviews. The first 2 have plagued academic writing for a long time. The third is a newer challenge of AI-generated literature review. Before we begin, let me point out a misunderstanding of what a literature review is supposed to accomplish. A literature review is not a summary of existing research. It is not a tour through what other people have said. Instead, literature review is an argument, and this argument is a theoretically grounded, logically sequenced case for why the problem you are studying truly matters, how prior research has addressed it, and where the existing literature falls short, and why your study is the necessary next step. Every sentence in your literature review should be doing the work in service of that argument. With that understanding, let's begin. The first and perhaps most common problem is making claims without specific cited evidence. This problem is even more pervasive when people use AI to write literature review. Here is an example. Research has shown that transformational leadership has a positive effect on employee outcomes. This sentence asserts a relationship as if it were settled fact, but it names no study, no author, no organizational context, and no effect size. There is no empirical evidence substantiating the claim. The reader has no way to evaluate the claim, no way to follow the evidentiary trail, and no reason to trust your command of the existing literature. Let's revise the sentence. Transformational leadership has demonstrated consistent positive associations with follower motivation and organizational commitment across educational, citation 1, healthcare, citation 2, and corporate context, citation 3, though effect sizes vary substantially by organizational culture and measurement approach. Next, I'll use empirical evidence to explain how effect sizes vary substantially by organizational culture and measurement approach. I'll start with organizational culture. To do so, I write, in organizations characterized by collaborative culture, transformational leadership has moderate to large effects on follower motivation and organizational commitment. And then I cite the specific empirical evidence. A recent meta-analysis of 58 studies reported that the correlation between transformational leadership and employees' organizational commitment ranged from approximately 0.34 to 0.6. with stronger relationships generally observed in organizations characterized by high levels of shared decision-making and trust. After presenting this specific empirical evidence on the relationship between transformational leadership and organizational commitment in strong collaborative culture, I needed to introduce the specific effect size of the same relationship in organizations characterized by less collaborative cultures. Let's look at what this revision accomplishes. It names specific scholars and studies in citations. It specifies the organizational context in which the effect has been documented. And importantly, it introduces the caveat that effect sizes are not uniform, which distinguishes rigorous scholarship from confident assertion. Without specific evidence, a claim has no explanatory power because the reader cannot interrogate the evidence behind it. Also, the subject of the revised sentence is transformational leadership, which is the focal point of your research. In my own writing, I don't start a sentence with research says or author A argued, because neither research or author A is the focal point of my research. The second problem with writing literature review is the absence of logical progression of your ideas. This is a failure to build an argument that accumulates and advances. Very often, I see the ideas in literature review are disjointed and incoherent. A literature review can be well cited and still incoherent if its ideas do not follow one another in a defensible order. Let me use an example to explain it. Distributed leadership has been associated with improved organizational performance. Citation 1. Employee burnout is a growing concern in public sector organizations. Citation 2. Instructional leadership has been shown to influence organizational outcomes. Each sentence in this paragraph is individually cited. Each sentence refers to a construct in the literature. The first sentence starts with distributed leadership. The second starts with employee burnout. The third starts with instructional leadership. But this paragraph has three unconnected propositions with no argument. Why do you put the three ideas together? How do they relate to one another? Where are you going? When I see this type of writing, I see the writer has cataloged the literature, but not yet synthesized the existing literature to make an argument. Here is a revision that builds logical progression. Early conceptualizations of leadership emphasized the hierarchical authority and positional power. From this view, senior managers are positioned as the primary drivers of unit performance in organizations. However, as organizations became more complex adaptive systems, leadership functions were necessarily distributed across formal and informal roles. Such a reconceptualization has implications for employee agency. That is, employee must be analyzed as co-constructors of the leadership context that shape their professional behavior and performances. Each sentence follows from the prior one. The first sentence starts with early conceptualization of leadership. The second sentence explains what hierarchical authority or positional power look like in organizations. The third sentence starts with, however, it points out the gap of the existing literature. The fourth sentence starts with reconceptualization, which is coherent with the subject of the first sentence of this paragraph. Also, the fourth sentence ends with employee agency. What does employee agency mean? It is explained in the fifth sentence. Here you are trying to build a chain. It starts with early hierarchical view, followed by its implications, which is manager-centric performance. And then you talk about the inadequacy under complexity, followed by reconceptualization of distributed leadership. And then you talk about the implication, which is employee agency. This is what logical progression looks like. It situates your study in existing literature gradually. Each sentence constrains the next claim and makes it necessary. Hierarchical leadership constrains causality to managers. That constraint implies manager-driven performance. Complexity contradicts that implication, and the contradiction necessitates a distributed reconceptualization, and that reconceptualization in turn necessitates redefining employees as co-constructors. Each sentence makes the next sentence necessary. The argument advances not by adding loosely connected ideas, but also by progressively eliminating alternatives until the subsequent claim becomes the most defensible, coherent position. Without the logical progression, your literature review has a longer list structure, which is a pattern of narrating individual sources rather than synthesizing them. This is very common in graduate student writing. Here is an example. Author A found that ambidextrous organizations outperform those who focus on a single competitive mode. Author B argued that dynamic capacities depend on organizational routines. Author C suggested that sensing and seizing opportunities are core to organizational level competitive advantage. 3 studies, 3 sentences, 0 empirical evidence, 0 synthesis. What do the 3 studies mean together? Are they reinforced or challenge each other? Do they collectively advance understanding of something? Can you follow the examples of 2 revisions I just made to revise this paragraph? Let's now turn to the unique problems of AI-generated literature reviews. There are some recognizable patterns that are now documented in empirical literature on scholarly publishing. The journal Organizational Science recently published some empirical evidence on AI impact on both journal manuscript submissions and peer reviews. This is a major academic journal in the field of management and leadership with a 5-year impact factor at 7.2. The authors, Claudine Gottenberg from University of Pennsylvania and her colleagues, analyzed a corpus of about 7,000 initial manuscript submissions and over 10,000 peer reviews submitted to the journal Organizational Science between 2021 and early 2026. To detect AI use in submitted manuscript and peer reviews, the authors used Pangram, which is a deep learning model designed to classify text as either human or AI-generated. Pangram outputs a continuous AI assistance score ranging from 0, which is fully human-written, to 1, which is fully AI-generated, by evaluating the text in roughly 400-word windows. An independent evaluation highlighted that Pangram has a false positive rate of less than 0.001 when evaluating samples from advanced AI models like ChatGPT 4.0, Claude Opus 4, and Gemini 2.0 Flash. In addition to detecting AI use in academic writing, the authors also measure writing quality by calculating a set of standard metrics focused on readability and stylistic features. What did they find? Their findings are sobering for anyone who thinks that AI tools improve scholarly writing. The journal's submission volume rose 42% following the release of ChatGPT in late 2022, but the writing quality declined sharply over the same period. Manuscripts with AI scores above 30% showed substantially higher death rejection rates, nearly 30 percentage points higher than human-written submissions, even though editors were not explicitly identifying the papers as AI-generated. What does death rejection mean? In academic publishing, a death rejection occurs when rejects it before sending it out for peer review. In other words, the paper never reaches peer reviewers. In Gartenberg's study, editors were simply conducting their normal quality assessment and repeatedly judged heavily AI-generated manuscripts to be weaker in many areas, such as argument development, theoretical contribution, methodological rigor, or scholarly writing. As a result, those AI-generated papers were disproportionately filtered out at the editorial stage. It suggests that extensive reliance on AI-generated text may introduce quality deficiencies that experienced editors can detect even without knowing whether AI was used or not. This is a key finding for graduate students to bear in mind. The problem with heavily AI-generated literature reviews is not that editors recognize them as AI-generated texts. It is that editors recognize them as poor writing. Many people assume that AI tools improve academic writing, particularly for those who find academic writing very, very challenging. But the data tell a different story. AI-generated text produces prose that is more difficult to read across nearly all standard measures. 2 specific stylistic problems are especially prominent. First, AI-generated writing is characterized by heavy nominalization, which is the conversion of verbs and adjectives into abstract nouns. Instead of writing that a leader decides, AI-generated text tends to say the leader's decision-making process. Instead of writing that employees resist change, AI-generated text tends to say resistance to organizational change initiatives. Nominalization makes writing more difficult to read, more difficult to follow, and more difficult to evaluate empirically because the verb, which is the action, the things that is actually happening, is buried inside a noun phrase. Good writing typically relies on strong verbs rather than abstract nouns because verbs show who is doing what to whom. Verbs make causal relationships clearer. They make arguments easier to understand, but excessive normalization does the opposite. Helen Sword called normalization as zombie nouns because they cannibalize active verbs, suck the lifeblood from adjectives, and substitute abstract entities for human beings. Here are two sentences. Sentence 1. The implementation of strategic decision-making processes facilitated the achievement of organizational objectives. Sentence 2, leaders made strategic decisions and achieved organizational objectives. Can you tell the difference? The first sentence is crowded with zombie nouns, implementation, decision-making, achievement, which hide the actors and actions. The second sentence uses strong verbs, made, achieved, which make the causal relationship clearer and the sentence easier to understand. When you convert verbs into nouns, the prose becomes unnecessarily abstract. As a result, the readers must work harder to identify the underlying process and causal mechanisms that you are attempting to describe. Another problem with AI-generated text is that it has more jargon, more ambiguous, and more underdeveloped arguments. The AI-generated text tends to be dense and technical, but lacks specificity and precision that true technicality requires. Here is an example of AI-generated sentences in literature review. The conceptualization of organizational effectiveness necessitates the operationalization of multidimensional performance constructs encompassing the attitudinal, behavioral, outcome-related dimensionalities of employee functioning within hierarchically differentiated institutional contexts. This sentence is unnecessarily long and almost meaningless. In addition to numerous zombie nouns, the sentence is ambiguous and lacks substantive content. Let's first convert the zombie nouns back into verbs. Researchers must define organizational effectiveness and measure how employees think, behave, and perform in organizations with different hierarchical structures. This sentence is better, but it's still full of ambiguity. Some of my colleagues would write BS in the comment section, which refers to be specific. Which researchers, which employees, what thoughts, what behaviors, what performance outcomes, and what organizations, what kind of hierarchical structures. They're all very ambiguous. Let's revise the sentence again by adding specificity. A rigorous study of organizational effectiveness in educational institutions must first define the construct, then specify the measures and the magnitude of the relationships. In K-12 schools, the construct is typically operationalized as student achievement. For example, a recent meta-analysis reported that school principals instructional leadership had a moderate positive effect on student achievement. In addition to student achievement as a measure of organizational effectiveness, school climate has also been used to measure organizational effectiveness. Instead of treating school climate as a single construct, researchers often examine specific dimensions, such as teacher trust in the principal, collective teacher advocacy, and academic press. For example, so on and so forth. Here, D is Cohen's D, which is a standardized effect size measure. It quantifies the magnitude of the difference associated with the instructional leadership. It means schools with stronger instructional leadership performed approximately 1/3 of a standard deviation higher on student achievement outcomes than schools with weaker instructional leadership. This revision adds specificity in different ways. It identifies the organizational setting, which is K-12 schools. It specifies the outcomes of interest, which is student achievement. It identifies the style of leadership under investigation, which is instructional leadership. It reports the magnitude of the relationship rather than merely asserting that leadership matters. It replaces ambiguous references measures to school climate with specific dimensions such as teacher trust, collective teacher efficacy, and academic press. Many AI-generated sentences fail to do so. They're often filled with ambiguity, very vague generalizations, and undefined construct. This problem is very common in graduate student writing, which can have 2-sentence or 3-sentence paragraph that provides insufficient explanation, evidence, or elaboration. Good scholarly writing requires specificity. Remember BS? Be specific. Effective writers identify the actors, the actions, outcomes, context, and causal relationships they seek to explain. They define their constructs, specify how those constructs are measured, describe the mechanisms that connect them, and use empirical evidence from the existing literature to support their claims. As you add those essential elements, your arguments naturally become more developed. A meaningful scholarly argument rarely fits into 2 sentences or 3 sentences paragraph because explaining a phenomenon requires more than making an assertion. It requires defining constructs, presenting empirical evidence, explaining causal relationships, and clarifying boundary conditions. Scholarly writing is judged by how clearly and convincingly it substantiates the claims. Writing is thinking. The struggle to write well is often the struggle to think well. Use AI to write literature review is like allowing someone else to do your workout while expecting your muscles to grow. The purpose of writing a literature review is not to produce pages. The purpose is to develop your capacity to reason theoretically, to evaluate evidence critically, and to construct a defensible scholarly argument. To develop those intellectual muscles, you must experience the struggle of thinking clearly, organize your ideas logically, and defending claims with empirical evidence. The words may appear on the page. The intellectual development takes place in the person who does the thinking.